Jed? Jed? Jed was asking, he thought that React Native was like a Babel kind of transform where you would build in the same way you like compile like Swift to native code, that you'd be compiling JavaScript to native code. But he has come to realize from what James said, so he understood it properly, that actually you're executing JavaScript, and this JavaScript is executing in the context of React Native inside of what's called JavaScript Core, which is the JavaScript engine, similar idea to like V8 or Chakra or SpiderMonkey or whatever. You know, there are a variety of JavaScript engines, but React Native uses JavaScript Core on iOS and Android. So you have your application running in JavaScript Core, and when there is an update, it's like it gets all of these commands, sends these commands to native. Then there's this native runtime for React Native that consumes those commands and performs the required updates in order to update the UI. So a way I like to think of it kind of is, it's like if you were running React Web inside of a web worker, and so you couldn't directly manipulate the DOM from your React code, but you generate a series of updates, and then those updates are sent over to your main JavaScript thread from the web worker, and then from there the actual updates happen. So it's the same sort of model. The only difference is rather than rendering to the DOM, it renders to the underlying views and whatnot that exist on that platform. Right? So let's have a look here quickly. Yeah, if we can turn that on quick. Here's a very, very simple diagram that Devin sent me that he thought would be helpful to clear it up. So you have a view. A view is, for those of you who were asleep yesterday, a view is a React Native thing. It's like a div, right? It's called a view. I don't know why it's not just a div, it's a view. But that translates on iOS to a UI view. It's just the name, again, but it's the name of the view class on iOS. So if you're writing an iOS app in Swift or Objective-C, you're going to be creating UI views. In the case of Android, translates to an Android view. And in the case of, if you're using something like React primitives, which I think Leland might talk about during the conference, you can also have a view that renders to a div in the browser. So there's no, React doesn't really make a lot of claims about what the ultimate rendering target is, right? There's the reconciler, and then there's various renderers. And so the reconciler is the thing that says you have this tree of components, and now you have a new tree of components. How do you reconcile the differences? How do you generate this like set, as the common phrase goes, like the minimum set of commands required to produce the new state from the previous state? And those commands are generated in the reconciler, and the renderer takes care of actually translating that into whether that's a UI view or an Android view or a div or like an Arduino, whatever shit they use for that, I don't know. That kind of thing. Good, I gotta laugh. All I do is swear once. I just keep swearing all day. Okay, yeah, we could stay on this for a little bit, just if we want to be like totally clear about it. Okay, who has questions about what we were just talking about here now? So right, bridge. Bridge, what is the bridge? Can someone try and summarize what it is in like a couple of sentences?
It's a middleman.
It's a middleman. Yeah, I mean, it is that. What else is it? Yeah.
It sends over messages, so it's possible to translate this diagram and JS view to another view of iOS.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And so the bridge does quite a few things that are helpful for us. One important thing to be aware of is the communication language between the native side of the bridge and the JavaScript side is JSON. So, right, you send over this command, you say, I want to perform this action on the view with this React tag, and the updated attributes or any associated information is attached to that as well. So you get a bunch of these sent over. Some of these things might be like date objects, for example. So if you're sending something like a date has been selected in a date picker, and that date is set maybe manually from the JavaScript side, you do set state, and you choose to say, I want to force the date on this date picker to be this thing. Then you send that over to the native side. The native side also has to translate the date string, which is just like a string in JSON, has to know, okay, this string is translated to NSDate on iOS or whatever. So it takes care of, in addition to having this kind of communication protocol with JSON, it also takes care of translating between types, between the two sides of the bridge. And then it just kind of, like the bridge kind of just stops at that point, right? It doesn't actually do the UI work. That's passed on to what I call the runtime, which I won't go into too much detail. It's just, you can maybe imagine how you might take JSON commands that are then deserialized and just like literally like a set of commands, and how you might turn that into some UI. That's kind of not super important. But what is really important is the bridge. And so in the case of like PhoneGap, the way the bridge worked was a lot less sophisticated, I guess you could say. I mean, there are various iterations of it, but one of the more common ones was, so PhoneGap, for those of you that aren't aware, is you have a web view, which is like you have a Chrome browser inside of your app. Usually make it full screen. You don't show the address bar. And when you want to make a call into a native API, so let's say you want to show like a native alert, or you want to open a camera, something like that, what you would actually do is change the URL to add some information to tell the native side, which has some listener attached to the web view, to parse that URL and see if it contains information for a command. And then if it does, then again, that moves into whatever specific stuff this plugin or this thing does in response to that. So that's like a very basic kind of bridge, right? Bridges don't have to, like, bridge is just a term that's meant like, how do we communicate this information from one language runtime to a different language runtime. And so in the case of Cordova, right, that's quite simple. In the case of React Native, what's happening is you actually call a JavaScript function. So let's say on the native side, well, let's think of timers. So from your JavaScript thread, you say set timeout, call this function in 200 milliseconds. What that does is it creates a command in the queue that says, okay, JS timers, create timer, gives it a callback ID, saves that callback because you can't serialize functions and send those across the bridge. So it saves that function into a sort of function registry, callback registry on the JavaScript side, and tells the native side to, okay, tell me when that 200 milliseconds has expired. And once that happens, once the timer expires, the native side will essentially just execute JavaScript. So it'll call, like, I think it's just execute script, something like that it calls on the actual engine itself, where it says, okay, with JS timers, call this function flush flush your timers with these IDs for all the timers that have expired in that time. That is sent over, then that's deserialized, turned into a function call that then executes all the timers whose IDs were given in that time, right? And this is just the fundamental for how everything works in React Native. It's all asynchronous, right? You pass everything across the bridge, and then some message comes back, or maybe it doesn't if that's not necessary. Okay, so that's a lot of like maybe theory stuff. Maybe we'll do one more question if someone has that, and then we'll get into like some real world examples of bridgeness. Yeah?
I think one of the bullet points was like you can just basically hammer the bridge by saying too large of a message. Like when does that happen?
So let's say you have like a 1 megabyte file that you want to send over to JavaScript. You want to just like take this string and you want to, I don't know, or maybe even like an object. You have an object that's just so massive. It's like you take a database and then you need to serialize the entire database and send it over to the JavaScript side so that on the JavaScript side you use Lodash and filter some things out and do some dumb query or something like that. Like you're going to have to, there's a huge cost to serializing that much stuff and then deserializing it as well, right? So you have to actually, when you say execute script and you pass in all that code needs to be parsed and then it needs to be executed. And when you execute it, you're actually then parsing the JSON string that comes in and instantiating all sorts of objects as a result of it. And so usually when we're talking about like heavy bridge traffic, it means something like passing large objects between different sides of the bridge. And so what you would want to do instead, like for example, for an image, you wouldn't want to, if you have like a 1 megabyte image, which is not entirely uncommon, you don't want to pass across the information for like all of the pixels in the image, right? You would rather just say, there's an image, it's image ID, whatever, or here's its file path, and do what you want with that. Or you do it in chunks or something like that. So you just have to be conscious when you work with the bridge to not kind of do that kind of thing. A real world example that we came across was for contacts. So when we built an API with Expo to let people access their contacts on their device, I learned that some people have like 20,000 contacts. And I don't know how that happens. You just go on LinkedIn and you're like, be my friend. And I'll never be unemployed. And then not with all these friends. But that's the problem, because if you're like, if you want to get all of the contacts, right? If you want to get all, if you want to get like 20,000 contacts and you don't use some kind of pagination or something like that, it's like, okay, here's this massive blob of data. On the native side, it's like, now I have to serialize the first name, last name, email address. I don't know, there's like, I think like 30 or 40 possible fields that you can do on contacts. So you have to serialize all of that for each of the 20,000 contacts. And so we had like bug reports of someone saying, I tried using contacts and my phone froze for like 20 seconds. And it was, we were like, oh, how many contacts do you have? Yeah, 20,000. Like, okay. That was probably our fault for not including a paginated API. But to be fair, who has 20,000 contacts? So that's an example of where you might look out for that. So common strategies to get around it are like pagination, or just sending the data that you need at any given time and chunking it. Okay.
That sort of stuff would require you to like make your own message side, like, in order to like be able to paginate contacts there. Like,
Yeah, so that was something that we wrote the native part of that. But I mean, there are examples of where you could do this potentially as well, just entirely from the JavaScript side. So we're going to talk about async storage later today, which is just a poorly named local storage. And if you try to send a megabyte of data over, you know, that's going to be bad times. Like if you save tons of data to your local storage, and then when you load your app, you get all of that data out of your local storage at the same time, then that's going to like take some time to do that. Because yeah, it just takes time to serialize and parse JSON. So that's the primary cause of that. You have lots of data, it takes time.